Composer. I don't know how many of you know what Composer is, but it's essentially a package manager for PHP. And this is as it says, a simple introduction, because I don't know that much about it, but I find that the best thing I can do to learn stuff about stuff is to give myself a deadline to talk about stuff. So this is me reinstating information in my head about Composer. So I'm going to backtrack and start at the very beginning of my PHP career and kind of work through that. I'm going to use my history and my pain as a way to kind of get towards Composer, as a way of kind of showing the way that PHP has grown into Composer, and hopefully with that in mind we'll have a better understanding of what it exists for, you know, and all that sort of stuff. So like I said, because it's history and it's my history, it's probably not your guys' history, but I get it. But depending on when you guys started in PHP, you probably will recognize elements of my pain. And I'm going to continue to refer to code when I'm in this talk, but when I say code, I really mean libraries, generally. Either libraries that I'm using or libraries that I'm creating. So, as a brief summary of my history and my pain, I've always had like 4 main pain points with PHP in the past. One is, where do I go to get code? I guess that's 1A. 1B is, once I know where to go to get the code, how do I get it? Which sounds like it's the same thing, but not really. Then the question is, what do I, oh, there you go, getting code. Using code. Once I've got the code, how do I actually get it into my project and get to use it? The third one, which is a pain in the ass, is getting my team to use the same code, and then sharing code. That's as in a library that I've built, trying to get other people to use it. When I talk about that, it's all going to be theoretical because I've never written a library that other people have wanted to use, which is probably a good thing, because. So pain point 1, getting code. Like I say, historically, when I started working in PHP, basically if I wanted to get a PHP library, I would do probably a Yahoo search at the time, and I'd end up on SourceForge or FreshMeat or some random developer's website, and I'd download a zip file and I'd extract it somewhere. I'd finally get it into my project. Oh my god, yeah, so step 1, download it. Right, this is the historical thing. I had to manage my own dependencies. If I downloaded, you know, a library and then I found out that it relied on another library, I'd have to go through the whole same process, recursively finding stuff, downloading stuff, putting it somewhere, making sure that the code works, and then finally it would all work. After that, I ended up using Pair. Pair kind of came in of its own. Pair is a curated system, right? It's its own little walled-in garden, right? They pick the packages that they want to use and they all fall into the Pair namespace. But the beauty of Pair was that you had this executable, and you could tell the executable, go and grab that library for me, and it would download it and stick it in a directory for us, which was great, because all of a sudden I didn't have to do it. It had a little bit of dependency management. It wasn't very good, but it was there, so sometimes it would download the extra stuff that you needed. Unfortunately, Pair really likes to be global, right? It likes to have the Pair installer or the downloader in your main directory, or like in your main path in user bin, or you know, wherever it would be in Windows. And when it downloaded code, it downloaded it into this global spot. So everybody, you know, which is great, everybody had access to it, but it also meant that you needed to have the right permissions for it. And that also meant that you needed to know where it was. And sometimes you needed to change a PHP ini file because you needed to include the files. Right? There was a whole heap of mess around Pair that I found. And then there was a whole other world of pain when I tried to put stuff up on the web, because all of a sudden my $2 a year shared server didn't have these Pair directories, right? And it was really hard for me to, because then I had to go and find them and copy them and stuff like that into another directory. It was just a pain in the ass. And like I say, we'd write the PHP ini files, but then sometimes you had different ini files for the web and different for the command line. It was just horrendous. Pair fades away. Right, this is probably, I don't know, 2004, I think it would be fair to say. Pair's kind of run its course. Because these people are maintaining these libraries, they don't keep up to date with it. There's all these other libraries that I want to use that they don't care to include in pair. So I ended up using less of it. I ended up using Git. Alright, downloading, all that sort of stuff. And I'm back to managing my own dependencies. I've got lots of libraries, it's great, but I had to handle it all myself. For a little while there's this talk of Pair 2 and Pyrus. Right, that's essentially them rebooting Pair, and it was crap. Well, it wasn't really, but it was okay. But it didn't go anywhere because by that time people were over Pair. Alright? There was a little, they were adding all this stuff and nobody cared. And then we come to Composer and Packagist. Composer is the new system that does dependency management, downloads my packages. The beauty of Composer over Pair is that it can have multiple sources. It's not this curated world, right? I can just point it to anywhere and I can just tell it to grab stuff. The dependency management is awesome, right? It'll go off and download stuff. Packagist is a website that lets you put up your own packages, right? So packagist.org is the website equivalent of the Pair website, right? I guess that's a question I probably should have asked before. Like, have you guys used Composer and stuff before? You have? A little bit, okay. So this might be a useless talk, but anyway, it's good for me. So Packagist is like the go-to for Composer installable code. The one negative thing of Composer that I find, and it may just be like a talking point, is the fact that Pair always had, on the flip side of Pair was Peckle, right? The installer for binary blobs, right? Extensions and stuff like that. Composer as it stands doesn't have that. However, there is an RFC called Pickle, which is essentially a Composer compatible version for installing extensions and libraries and whatnot. So although it's a problem at the moment, it won't be a problem in the future. So that was step one, my problem. Step two, my problem is using the code. Alright, when I first started writing my code, require once, get my includes. Alright, everyone's written that line, and if you haven't been writing PHP long enough, I don't think. And then I go to auto load. Alright, it's a single function that's defined for PHP, and I tell it, I define this thing, and then I'm really smart because all of a sudden it passes in my class name, and I map it all, and I do all this cool stuff. Alright, and then I get screwed because all of a sudden all these other libraries that I'm including are trying to do the same thing. Alright, so then I get smart again, I use SPL auto load register. Right, which lets me give it a function, and they give it a function, and they give it a function. There, all of a sudden, everybody's fighting because they've all got these functions, and they're fighting over this. But it seems to work. And then there was adding pair to your include path when we got to the pair point, right? Which again felt cool because all of a sudden it would say, "There's the directory, there's the stuff. You can include it from there," assuming that you can read, and assuming my downloader works, and assuming I can set it on the website, right on my web server. So that's a pain in the ass. And then we get to Composer. Composer automatically handles all this auto loading. It's a beautiful thing. We end up just having a require once, an auto load file, and it takes care of it all. It handles all the stuff. Pain point number 3, using the same code as everyone else. It's time consuming, it's inaccurate, confusing, and annoying as hell for source control. Right? I can't count the number of times somebody's gone and added a dependency for, well, we're going to use Swift Mailer for this stuff. I'm like, that's awesome. Which version? 1.2.3? Is that like the release candidate 4, or is that like the final? Right? Do you download the zip file, or do you pull it from Git? Does it need to be in a particular directory? And if so, which one? Right? And then they go, well, actually, it was just master, and it seemed to have a tag of 1.23. And it's just a pain in the ass. Right? So then you check it into source control so that everybody's got the exact same version, and then you just fluffing up your thing, right? It's just getting big and it's getting annoying. And then comes around and someone's like, oh, we need a new version of Swift Mailer for something. And then somebody goes and grabs the latest version again from Git and just sticks it in and blah, 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 and you're all screwed again, right? It's just annoying. Nobody knows if things are breaking. Nobody controls anything. and you're just fortunate that everybody ends up with the same code. Pain point number 4 is sharing code. With my team, I write a little bit of code to work in the team. Other teams in the company that I work for, sometimes I write something that's not too bad, and other people can use it. And then sharing with everybody in the world, right? That's like the third level, and I guess the biggest level of sharing your code. So, with all of that in mind, that's the pain that I've felt over this time. With that in mind, what is Composer? So Composer is a command line application with project-specific settings. That is to say, instead of having this big global blob of directories that Pear gave us, Composer just keeps everything in the project that you're working in. All right? You have a little composer.json file, and it's all relative to that bundle, to your project. Everything happens in there, and you might have to replicate it or duplicate it in other projects, but at least it's all there and nothing fucks with anything else. All right, imagine if you were working on 2 projects and one needed SwiftMailer 1 and the other needed SwiftMailer 2, and you were installing it via Pear. Pain in the ass, all right, because it's all trying to trample over each other. With this, everything just keeps in its own little projects. As I said, it uses a JSON file to declare the requirements, and everyone knows JSON, one would hope. So with Composer in mind, how does it solve my 4 pain points? For getting and using and syncing code, it's a way to declare requirements, a way to install those requirements, and a way to replicate them. For sharing my code, it's a way to declare pre-requirements, install pre-requirements, and a way for others to install the code. The same way. There's no difference. When we go to install Composer, we don't have this global problem like Pear did. We go to getcomposer.org, and we either download the file, which is a composer.far file, or we can even run, they even give you on the website, curl, you just grab an installer and pipe it through your shell, and then it just installs for you. You can install it globally if you like, but if you download this file here, you can just stick it in with the project. It doesn't have to be anywhere in particular, as long as it's executable, it's all good. It doesn't even have to be executable, you can call it PHP. For those who haven't seen that before, a far file is just a PHP archive, right? It's essentially a zip file of all the PHP code, so it's one single file that's delivered to you. So, to install Composer, we get the Composer far file, we put it somewhere, either next to wherever, it could be in my home directory, anywhere we want, and that's it. As opposed to Pear. Do you guys ever use Pear? Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. And I hope that, like, I know I'm kind of keep shitting on Pear, but it was a real pain in the ass, especially in Windows. To get our code, we create this Composer JSON file. It's just simple JSON. We can require particular versions of PHP. We can require PHP libraries. We can not only just a different version of PHP, we can require it to be 64-bit if we want. We can require a particular version of HHVM. We can require extensions of PHP, libraries of PHP. The versioning is cool, because here we say Symfony 2.3 point anything, don't care. Twig extensions, this tilde tells us if you're using semantic versioning, right, which says that, 1 point anything shouldn't, it's all backwards compatible, right? 1.9 should support code written for 1.0, and 1.9.4 should support stuff that's written for 1.9.2, for example. So by putting this tilde at 1.0, that's saying I'll take any version of that from 1.0 up to, but not including 2. Is that right? 1.0, yeah, anything up to and including 2. So semantic versioning, that kind of says I'll take anything that semverse says I should be able to support. But you can see you can use greater than, equal to. You can use commas as like and requirements. I need greater than or equal to 5.3.3 and less than 5.4 or less than 5.3.7. You can also use pipes for an or if you needed to. And here is @dev just says, for this particular piece of code, I'm happy to use something that's marked as still in development. All right, it's not stable yet. And that's it. That would install a heap of stuff, right? And here I'm going to show you what exactly we would install. It's not in this file. What I want to look at is, let's have a look at the vendor directory. So that one file, 1, 2, 3, 4 requirements. PHP, we won't count that. But we end up installing all of these directories here. Right, because each requirement that we have is able to dictate its own requirements. And Composer is taking care of our dependencies for us.
A question.
Yeah.
Is it possible to have multiple directories with multiple versions to test different versioning problems? So you could say have PHP 5.3 and other one PHP 5.4, but all the other dependencies would be similar, the same type of thing?
No. You'd have to have it installed as a separate project.
The reason why I ask is if you're trying to upgrade to a major version or something, can you still, with Composer, run the old one and develop on the new one at the same?
Well, I mean, you can still run it and develop on it because Composer is just managing your requirements.
So just that project?
Yeah.
So you just have two different projects?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's not like this isn't going to enforce stuff. So if you went and changed stuff later on, like if you went and then changed the PHP version, code's still gonna try and run. Right. It's only when you do when you're running Composer will it go and say, hold on a second, you know, unless you explicitly run Composer after you've changed the PHP version. Only at that time is it going to say there's a problem here. Right. It's not going to. It's not watching your code and saying, oh, okay, environment's changed, therefore.
Okay.
Right.
So it's static.
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. So with this, and basically, to get all that, we just had to run Composer install on the command line, and it grabbed all of these requirements here. So, just as the screen says, just a note about stability. So here it says there, PHP unit 4.3 ..star@dev. Right, so that's saying that this is this is assuming that I, by default, have said minimum stability has to be stable. My code, these libraries have to be marked as stable for me to use them. And that's the default for Composer. But here, PHP unit, I've said, for PHP unit, I'm okay with it being dev. You know, beta or whatever. You can have beta and alpha and all that sort of stuff. It doesn't have to be stable. That gets us into a little trickiness in that when I go to do Composer install, PHP unit itself has its own requirements, right? And if you look here, this is the Composer JSON file that belongs to PHP unit. Down here we have PHP unit, PHP code coverage, which is also allowing dev, dev, dev. This is the one thing I don't like about Composer. I understand why they do it, but it still frustrates me because I always forget about it. But even though I've explicitly said dev PHP unit is fine, my project still requires minimum stability stable, unless I say otherwise. These prerequisites, even though I've said I'm happy with dev PHP unit, if it itself has dev requirements and it can't find stable versions, because Composer will still try and find a stable version, but if it can't, it's oh, okay, well I can use dev for this particular library, I'll go for it. Even though I've said I'm okay with dev version of PHP unit, that doesn't mean I'm okay with these dev versions. Right? I have to explicitly go and tell my Composer JSON file, yeah, these ones here are also okay. Right? So that's one thing that you can get stung by is if it decides that the best thing that it can do is install these dev versions, and I haven't explicitly said you can install those as well, then it'll stop because it won't install PHP unit. I'm trying to think now why I actually wanted the dev version of PHP unit in the first place. There was a reason I wanted that. Whatever it is, it's just something that we have to, you know, Composer will tell you, hold on a second, you know, you're trying to install this, you know, you're trying to install PHP code coverage, at dev stability and it's not gonna work. You know, it tells you what's going on, but unless you're really thinking about it, the first thing you're gonna say is, "Fuck, I'm not trying to install PHP code coverage at all." All right, it's just one of those things.
Which file takes priority? Your composer .json or this one? Because PHP in certain versions in both of them. Like which one would get installed?
Well, that's not going to install PHP. This is just requiring the version of PHP.
Right.
Right. But the one that gets followed, well, it's both.
But let's say if your composer has like a previous version or an earlier version of this requirement, it would pull this one.
Yeah.
Or
So
would it take the one you wrote?
Of the what?
Probably
Sorry?
have to take this one, I guess. Or
Of this requirement?
would be satisfied.
It's going to take whatever is going to make both things happy.
Right.
Right. And if my code says less than 533, but I want PHP unit, and PHP unit says it's got to be greater than or equal to 533, it's just going to say you can't do it.
Right. Yeah.
Right. It does that conflict management type
Okay.
thing. Right. Same as like, you know, here Symfony YAML tilde 2.0. If my code says, you know, 2.5, then it'll just install 2.5. Right, so it just tries to, it picks the version, the most recent version that will satisfy everything.
Yep.
And if it can't work that out, then it just doesn't do anything at all. Is that
Yep.
cool? Okay.
Cool.
So, that's that. So again, we come back to this, how do I use it? Now, because, like I was showing you, this vendors directory here, so imagine that I've called composer install from this Symfony 255 directory, and it just creates this vendor directory, puts everything in here, and here we see this auto load PHP file. So long as I install that file, it takes care of all of this. So have a look at the code there. Vendor auto load. You can see that it's just made this like it just makes up a name and it has this function called get loader. If I look in there, auto load real, and make composer, auto load real. Suffice to say, it basically builds these files based on the rules because we can like by default, the whole naming directory structure is meant to be PSR 0 or PSR 4 compliant, but we can tell it in one of the libraries we install might decide that it's going to have its naming structure like this, and we end up anyway. They all kind of feed into this one file. We end up with this file here, which. There's a whole heap of them, but basically it's just like, it just builds all these random files that will all come together, so it's kind of keeping track of it all, bringing it into a simple function that you just call, or it calls. You know, so this one is PSR 4 compliant. These are the bundles that are 4 compliant, so it throws them into this file, and then it kind of builds and builds and builds, and then it's all kind of done. That was a horrible explanation, and I apologize.
Thanks for me.
Just did it? Oh, I'm glad. I'm glad. My other complaint that I always had was, you know, using the same code as everyone else, making sure that everybody's on the same version. That's where this file called the composer.lock file comes into play. And this is something that it took me a long time to actually understand. What composer lock does is it records exactly what work it did by running the composer JSON file. So for example, close all here. This is the composer JSON file for Symfony 255. There's, you know, what's that? Maybe 10 lines of requirements. A few random things here. If I were to look at, so I run composer install, and it works out all the versions that it's going to install, it works out all the dependencies it's going to do, and then it does the work. And once it's done the work, it creates this file, which is essentially the actual stuff that it did. Now we can see exactly which version of doctrine annotations it used. We can see where it got it from. We can see this is probably a hash, the git, the commit ID and all that sort of stuff. So whereas we said, doctrine annotations v1, whatever, it's like, okay, this is the one I'm using. This is where I got it from. This is it. Now the important thing is when I can commit and check in my composer JSON file to my repo, I also add composer lock, right? So now when Alex pulls the code out, he has a composer JSON, a composer lock file, and then he does composer install. And what composer install actually does first is looks at the lock file. And it goes here, it's like, okay, I see what you were using, so I'm going to use that too, right? So even though I said v1.2. When I did install, and the latest I could get was 121, Alex, when you run it, if my composer JSON file says 12* and now just 127, right? In theory, you would get that, but because I was on 121, you're going to get this, right? It's going to keep everybody in sync, and it's not until one of us runs composer update where it goes, okay, I'm going to try and get the latest versions that I'm legally allowed to get. And then he might go get 128, right? And then 129 might come out, and then you might run update and you'll still get 128. So it just keeps us all in lock, right? And that's the key to kind of making sure that everybody's using the same code. And that was one thing that I always kind of didn't understand when I was first using Composer, because to me a lock file is more, I have control. It's just a flag almost, right? And I couldn't understand why I needed to install. I didn't know why I needed to add this lock file to my repo, because to me it was almost like an artifact. But that's the thing that keeps everybody in lock, locked together. Maybe is a better way.
Would it be advantageous to modify that file in a way, shape, or form, or would you always rely on your JSON?
You would always rely on your JSON file. Yeah, unless for some, well, you know what, if your JSON file is 12* and the next version, if you were to do update, you were going to get 128, but you really wanted 127. I mean, there's two ways you do it, right? You go in and edit the lock file to 127 blah, right? Or you just change your JSON file and explicitly say 127. It'd be better to make the change in the JSON file.
Can you make changes to your JSON, update your system, and then push up the log file, and then have Composer go through it to basically figure out what you need to update? Is that what it does?
That's what it does, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so in theory, when we first commit the code, we don't ever commit anything in vendor directory. We just commit JSON and lock file. And then when you run it, the first big dip is, I've got nothing, shit, I'm going to go get it all. And then the next step is, it'll always look at the lock file, see what's going on there, if you have a lock file. So in theory, I would make the change in my JSON file. I'd run the update, which would update the lock file, then I'd commit the two of them, and then you'd pull it, and then you would then do an update, and it'll look at the lock file.
Does it remove any older versions, so it keeps them doing that kind of?
Yeah, it doesn't keep the code itself isn't in a version directory as such.
Right.
So it will just basically blow away that directory, depending on for doctrine annotations, it would just do a git pull with this ID.
Right.
This one here, it would just download a zip file or something like that. There's a few different ways it can source it, but the end result is no history of what was there.
Okay.
Yep.
Very handy.
Right, exactly, yeah. And so long as we keep it at PHP Unicode, there won't be artifacts. They keep their code pretty clean. And so, again, and importantly, we want to look at, when we're working with this stuff, we want to look at the JSON file, because it's really just looking at the stuff that I care about. I don't really care if I didn't ask for doctrine annotations, if that's needed by doctrine, and I'm just care about doctrine, I don't give a shit what version that is. It'll work out what version it wants. I know what version of doctrine I want, so I just put that in the JSON file, and it can work out all the other stuff. All right, that lock file has everything, not just the stuff that I wanted. It's the stuff that the other dependencies needed. Okay. So when I'm sharing code with my team, other teams, anybody, one of the things that you kind of really want to do is you don't want to have to change your thinking, right? It's really nice that it would be nice to be able to have the same. What's a good way to put this? I've learned how to write a composer JSON file to install stuff, so it'd be really nice to be able to write a composer JSON file to share stuff. I guess that's it, all right? And so what do we need to share code? We need our composer JSON file, somewhere to store it, an entry on packages, and that's it. So I'm just going to quickly go through that. Let's have a look at Vendor, Twig. So this is imagine that I wrote Twig. Imagine. It's just a normal composer JSON file. It has some extra stuff at the top here, but it's not really important. You know, it requires PHP, has some auto load information, and that's it. If I look at a more complex one, Sensio Labs, security checker, composer JSON, same information. It has a couple of requirements, you know, and it requires this version of, you know, Symfony console, which is exactly, you know, if I was writing a library, that's what I'd have to do. If I need security, if I needed Symfony console, I just require it, right? So it's exactly the same process, all right? So I have that composer JSON file in my bundle, and I might zip it up or put it on GitHub, and then other people can access that however they want. You know, you can add repos to your composer JSON file so you know where to pull this stuff from. The easiest way to do this is with packages, right? So what I was talking about, pair being this curated garden, the beauty of packages is I create an account, I go give it a name, and I say, I have this bundle called what I'm calling it this, and it's over on GitHub, and then that's it, right? When I then go and say, require Lincoln/coolness, right, it's going to go to packages first. It's like, what do you know about Lincoln coolness? And probably it'll say, oh, doesn't exist. But if it didn't say that, it would say, oh yeah, go get it on GitHub, right? So I don't need to store anything on packages. I can just say GitHub, blah, 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 all right? So basically packages is just a website of metadata. And so that's how I share my code. All right, I just create a composer file, and I basically tell packages where you can find my composer JSON file, and then the world can install it. You know, they can all bask in my coolness. So as far as that composer JSON file is concerned, then, for when I'm sharing data, I can put in a package name and a version, the description, the license, authors, extra repositories. So you know, I said you can tell it Git. I mean, we saw that, right? We can kind of say you can access my code through Git. You can access it through SVN. You can get it from a zip file. Here's a URL, right? And you just bang, bang, bang. Here's all the different ways you can get my code, and it'll just go and find the best way for it to do it. The prerequisites, software that's required, suggestions, so I can say, you know, perfect example of that is like Monolog, which is the logging framework. It suggests MySQL, Postgres, Mongo, whatever, right? And you basically pick one. You go, oh, I'm going to use Monolog, Postgres. So you add that as another requirement, then all of a sudden Monolog's just going to write to Postgres, all right? Branch aliases, so I can, you know, pretty versions and all that sort of stuff. Stability information requirements, and you could even say, like, you know, if I'm installing as production, I want this, this, and this. But when I'm installing as on a dev environment, also include this, right? A lot of these packages include PHP unit when you're installing it on dev, and then all of a sudden it requires PHP unit, and then you can run the tests on it. And dare I say that this composer is the best way to install PHP unit, because it always sucks, especially through pair. auto load information, pre and post hooks. So if my installer needs to run stuff before or after it gets installed, I can put all of that in there. PHP code up in game. And so much more. As far as the auto load component information, like I say, by default it expects, I think it's PSR 0 or PSR 4, which is like the FIG rules. It's essentially like the standard, right? We use these rules for naming conventions and directories and stuff, and if we stick to that, then it's all hunky-dory. But if I decide that I actually want my code to be sitting in this subdirectory of, this directory over here, I can tell it to put it there if I want to. People won't like me, but I can tell it to stick it wherever it wants. So there's this thing called status, don't know. It looks like a word that you'd know how to pronounce, that's all. Could it be both? No? This thing allows us to basically create our own internal version of packages.org. One of the arguments I see about this composer thing is, if I'm not storing all of my dependencies in source control, what happens when the world blows up and I can't get to packages.org? This is your answer, all right? And basically, it's just a static repository generator for Composer. It's another tool that can come with Composer that you use, and you basically say, here's all the things in my requirements, now you go and store a copy of them, right? And it's defined by another JSON file. And then, so we define this JSON file, we tell it, here are my requirements, almost like a Composer JSON file, right? But it's almost like I don't even know what you call it, it's like a wrapper, right? Instead of calling it Composer, I say it's status, and then I run this application, and all of a sudden it creates a web interface that serves up that stuff, right? I've told it that I want this, this, and this. I want you to serve these things up, so it goes off and gets a copy, caches it locally, right? And then just as before, when we said that we run, we can add a repository of source control or a zip file or whatever. I'll get back to that. We just add this type Composer repository. So your Composer file, and you point it at your status install, and all of a sudden it can be pulled from there, right? I mean, this is great for all sorts of reasons, especially if, depending on how big your dependencies are and how often you're pulling them and how flaky your internet is, it's not a bad way to basically cache it. And there it is there. So this is that recursive nature of these files, right? With a Composer JSON file, we add these repositories to tell it different ways to get the code. With the status file, we add these repositories telling it different ways to get code, and then you can compose a JSON file to a different repository that is represented by this file. And then it's just all cached and stuff like that. And thankfully, that's it.
Start over again?
No. No, I'm not. So yeah, is there questions, comments, concerns?
I had a question, but I doubt you'd actually run into it, because this is just for pulling PHP code, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it never has to compile anything.
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
Until Pickle is
Until
built.
there's a bit of integration?
Yeah.
Because we use pip
Right.
at work for Python.
Yes.
packages, right? And I've run into weird issues, like when you pull, say, like some Postgres stuff.
Yeah.
It requires basically the development version of some Postgres binary be installed on the server, so it can basically compile the Python package.
Right, because you need
that
that.
you're trying to pull down.
Because you need the Postgres debug or
Yeah,
Postgres
exactly.
dev libraries. Yeah.
Something like
Yeah.
that. So yeah, this wouldn't come into anything of that nature because it doesn't do any compile.
Right.
Right.
But you can get it.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you imagine? Yeah. I mean, imagine.
Yeah,
if
like
you
if you made it run a script that did compile something that required it install something on the server, then you have to give it root access to install the stuff on the server. And that's just a mess.
Yeah. You wouldn't want to get into that sort of stuff.
Yeah. It's also a problem that only I would run into is upon setting up the servers the first time.
Yeah. Awesome.
Once the server's running, doesn't matter how many Python packages you install or how many different times you install. So this is cool because it's like in Python we use pip to install packages, and we use virtual env to split stuff out into little kind of like mini systems.
Yep.
To have, you know, dozens of things installed in the same server, but
Yep.
they can run whatever version of Django they want, but
Yep.
they're all stuck inside their own virtual environment.
Yeah. Yeah, so this would
That's neat.
deal with this because each one is local to the project.
Yep.
The only thing that we don't get with Composer as compared to VertEnv, is that what it's called? VertEnv? Is that what do you call it?
Virtual env is what
Virtual,
that's
yeah.
the full back.
Yeah. So that gives you specific versions of Python too, right?
It can,
Right.
but for the most part, it's pretty much you install pip and virtual env on the main system.
Yeah.
And then you run virtual env to create the virtual directory, go in there, change your source, and changing the source basically tells the system, it gives it all new Python paths.
Okay.
And then you just use pip to install stuff normally.
Right,
and
yeah.
it sticks it into the new Python paths, which is like a subdirectory underneath the directory that virtual env created.
Yeah. The only reason I asked that is because I was listening to something there's a thing called Atlantic PHP, which is all about, and they were saying that this is supposed to be the PHP version of virtual env,
Yeah.
where you can have multiple versions of PHP and stuff like that.
Yeah, there'd be no reason why you couldn't do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Sorry, go ahead.
Do you have a way to take out the extra stuff get down the layer and the packages that kind of the composer or maybe the dependency? It comes with a lot of, well, some of the packages I use, it comes with a lot of examples.
Yeah.
How do you get rid of them in composer?
I don't.
I'm not going to release some, so that I do that.
Well, I would guess that in theory, if you say that you're doing so the command line option is, I think these days you do no dev to say, I'm doing this in production. So in theory, the package itself could say, oh, this is a prod install, I'm not going to install that documentation. And that would be, if you do that no dev, that's when, you know, all these ones because you have require and then you have required dev. You know, so you say no dev and it doesn't install that stuff, so it doesn't install PHP unit. In theory, the packages could then go and say, oh, well, if you know, that would be up to the package. I would probably suggest maybe you make a pull request and change your composer.json file. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, we haven't really run into that problem. I think we just kind of eat it. Yeah, you know, like, okay, maybe, you know, even if there's like 400 meg of documentation, like, you know, I don't know.
Yeah,
No.
none of the stuff you install with Composer gets pushed into your guys' Git repo.
Right, yeah, we don't add anything under vendor. We don't commit.
That's like the real headachy part of I've ever found of all that example code is when that sometimes gets jammed into your Git repo.
Yeah.
It's you know, thousands of lines of code. It has to make sure it isn't changed.
Yeah. Oh yeah, especially when then they go and you get the next version and for whatever reason, all of a sudden every line in the documentation has an extra space at the end of it. So every file's changed. I'm like, oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know the answer to that. Sorry.
So I'm going to miss this, but how does it know where to find the list of available versions? Basically the actual version itself.
Okay, so this is what we can put this repository as Composer into our Composer JSON file to say, here's my status install, right? Let's assume then that by default, the first default repository, even if I haven't put it in my Composer JSON file, is type composer url packages.org, right? And then we just assume that type composer knows how to deal with packages, and that's when we say symfony/symfony, you know, version 2.5 point star, it goes off to Packagist, says, what do you know about Symfony/Symfony? Let me see if I can bring it up here. If you add, like, basically it goes through the repositories, all right? So if we've got this one here, we have a composer type. If we had the version control repository here, right? And we want to have 4, but it's almost like the very first one is always packages.org, right? So it'll hit packages.org, find out what it knows about Symfony there. I don't know if it'll hit every one of them and go, okay, now what's the most recent one I know from all of these repositories? Or if it'll just go, okay, I found one that one of these repositories provides enough, it provides a valid selection for what you're requesting. So there's this metadata, right? So it goes and says, okay, what do you know about Symfony? And it comes back, it's like, okay, I know the version such and such, it has this stability branch here. I know that this version has this here, right? Bang, bang, bang. And then it goes, okay, well, I know that you want 2.5 and that requires this, and works it all out, and then it says, okay, we're going to hit this one over here.